We all come together each week in a meeting, and sometimes we spend an hour discussing what's in a quesadilla. Like, how do you define a quesadilla, as one example? We go down some real rabbit holes, and this is very much a first draft. So, whatever we do now will be subject to review by editors, by linguistic experts, by specialty experts. So, we have people working on definitions, we have people working on the etymologies, researching origins of words, people working on pronunciations. It will look probably quite different in the final version, but it's allowed us to develop our procedures and figure out how exactly do we want to do this work, and when we expand the team and bring in more people, what is it that they'll be doing?
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Tyke.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Community Foundation in support of the Adirondack Community Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. Today on the show, we're talking about dying with dignity. You know, we all want to die with dignity, but sometimes we find ourselves in embarrassing situations like falling into the machinery at a cereal production plant or being exploded.
Death by lard. Ethan Shanty with us in the studio now. Hi, Ethan.
Hello, Mitch.
Ethan's our producer here on Northwards. Ethan, you use words.
Often, sometimes.
You know, so
I use big word, but few word do trick.
what was it's a Steve Martin line, so I can't take credit for it. But as he once said, some people have a way with words, and other people not have way, I guess.
Perfect.
I bring this up because maybe it's just more evidence that I am old.
You're not that old.
No, I know.
You're older than me.
Right. I'm older than you. I'm older than, and I'm also older than people who are younger than you.
True. Yeah, great.
So, like I got to thinking about like lingo and slang that the generations use. And so I was thinking about this partly because of the interview that airs this week on Northwards, which we'll talk about in a minute, but partly because I'm in this hyper-competitive online trivia league.
Oh, right, yeah.
They do these special one-day trivia contests in between seasons, and I entered a couple of them, and most of them are really, really specific. I once finished in 7th place out of like 5,000 entries. On a trivia contest entirely about NPR.
Okay, well,
probably a shame that I only finished in 7th place.
You're kind of cheating, but yeah, how didn't you get the top spot? Anyway, go ahead.
Anyway, and I don't even remember what this one was about, but there was a question that referenced a piece of slang, of Gen Z slang.
Okay.
And the answer was boop.
Boop?
Which is apparently a term that people use both onomatopoetically and also I don't really remember exactly what it's about, but
I use it to denote when you're like bopping somebody on the nose or like touching their nose.
Right,
boop.
exactly. Mostly with dogs.
Mostly with dogs or cats. Yeah, we boop our cat.
But apparently, the younger people today use the term boop to gently touch somebody, and they say boop at the same time.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's not happened to me, which is, I think, good.
I did not get that answer right. And I was thinking, I feel like the slang is coming faster and more furiously than it ever has before. Like, slang terms show up, the whole 6-7 business.
Right.
Like, is anybody going to remember the 6-7 business, like, I don't know, 6 months from now?
I mean, those kids who used it will, but it'll be a thing where, like, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, someone will go 6-7. They'll say, "Didn't we used to say that all the time?"
What was that about? Right.
Yeah. I don't delude myself into thinking that I can keep up with the younger generation's slang at all. I don't even try. My word choices haven't really changed too much since I was, in my early 20s. I'm sure that's the case for you. Call everybody dude, everything's cool or radical, or I'm stoked about things. I think that's probably when I really date myself when I talk to younger people, when I say, "Oh, I'm really stoked about your band, the song that just came out." And they're like, "Stoked?"
People are not using stoked anymore?
I don't think so.
Huh.
I use it because I like it. Yeah, I credit myself as being the person who's responsible for the revival of the word stoked because I adopted it. I even used it for
Back in your days as a stevedore.
a what?
Stevedore, somebody who loads coal into a coal furnace that runs a train or I think really a steamship. You'd be stoking the fire. See,
That's slang that the young kids are definitely using, Mitch.
I don't even think it was slang. I think that's just the word for somebody whose job is to do that.
Well, but isn't that the case with all slang? Like it's just adopted and co-opted into mean something else, right? Yeah, but I had a blog called stokedreviews.blogspot.com. Don't look it up. That's embarrassing. But I was an intern for Cinema 10, an organization in Potsdam that runs independent movies twice a year. And
they were stoked to have you, I'm sure.
They were stoked to have me, and nobody told me I couldn't call it Stoked Reviews. So I just started saying I was stoked about everything, and then all my friends did. Like I was doing it ironically, of course, and then it just becomes a thing that you say constantly. Yeah, I'm still stoked about everything.
This I'm going to make strange mouth noises now. Going back to Bill and Ted, this is like the equivalent of excellent versus bogus.
Right.
Right.
I do love Bill. Which Bill and Ted do you prefer? The first one or the second
I prefer
one?
the first one.
You do?
I'm a traditionalist.
I think I prefer Bogus Journey because it's the one that I saw first and the one that I saw most often. And also it has that amazing song from Kiss at the end of the soundtrack. And that's the first and last time you'll ever hear me admit that I like a Kiss song. Anyway, those movies and every movie of every period uses generational slang to get their point across, and it's changing constantly. We're being left behind because we're getting older.
Well, right, and also because I think it's going faster.
Because of the internet, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, the stories we always hear right around the end or the beginning of the year of, okay, Merriam-Webster is adding such and such a word to the dictionary because it is popular now. And I wonder whether those words stick around in the dictionary for more than a couple of years or they're already gone by the time the next edition of the dictionary comes out. And then I started thinking about what were those words when I was young, and I can't think of any of them.
No, I can't either, aside from stoked. But it's not a thing that ever left my lingo, you know?
I mean, awesome really sort of came of age when I was a younger person. And, I think awesome has always been a word, but
it
like
means
as
different
an
things.
intensifier.
Yeah, right, exactly.
I think we've had this conversation on this program before.
Yeah.
I am not a Stranger Things watcher, but what I gather is the producers, the writers and producers of that show did a really amazing job of capturing the essence of 1980s life, including its technology at the time. But really as well, in some ways, nostalgia for that era, and in other ways, sort of introducing younger people today to what life was actually like in those days.
I can't say because I didn't live through the 80s. I was born in 88, so I'm a kid of the 90s. Obviously the technology from the 80s carried over through much of the 90s. I don't think that there were like a ton of technological developments that came into our household. Like the big thing was getting a computer with the internet in like 97. And then we didn't really progress after that. But what I can say is that Stranger Things definitely apes the movies of the 80s, the 70s and 80s that it's influenced by. And so that's a success. Not having lived through it myself, I don't really know. You should watch it, but you're not a horror fan, so I don't know if you'd even like it.
No, but it is entertaining to see what songs my Gen Z kids are listening to as a result of being exposed to them through Stranger Things, because it amazes me that like Kate Bush is having a moment now.
Right, and I know that "Purple Rain" by Prince is climbing up the charts again, so to speak. Are your kids listening to that too?
I don't know that they are.
Huh. Well, they should be.
Yeah.
Set them straight. Anyway, today's interview
does talk about language.
Yes.
And what got me down that particular train of thought was a really brief news story I saw someplace that that there was a Canadian word of the year named. And first of all, I was just entertained by this idea, but a closer read of a very short news item revealed that it was done by people who were putting together a Canadian English dictionary. And the
Okay.
first thought I had was, this is like translating Canadian into English. But no, it's actually, we think of Merriam-Webster, but it's like the Merriam-Webster Dictionary of American English or whatever, or the Oxford English Dictionary or what have you. And this effort is to not just create an English dictionary, but an English dictionary that's specific to, the language as a whole, but also the language as it is spoken and written and heard in Canada. So there are a lot of different influences to the language in Canada that either don't exist or exist differently in the United States or England or India or Australia or other places that English is spoken. It turns out that one of the leading institutions in this effort is Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, which, right in our neighborhood. And I reached out to the person who directs the Strathie Language Unit, which is within Queen's University, the unit that is doing this work. It's a woman named Anastasia Riehl, and she actually lives in Toronto, but also works in Kingston. I reached her at her home in Toronto. Anastasia Riehl, thank you so much for making some time to talk with us.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
So I am talking to you from Canton, New York, which is at 44.6 degrees latitude north, while you are in Toronto, which is interestingly at 43.6 degrees north. That is all to say there is not really that much that physically separates the northern tier of the U.S. from the southern tier of Canada. So why is it that there are distinct language differences between places that are so close to each other?
Well, I like that you asked the question in a way that you're assuming that there are differences, because there are differences, right? And people often ask, like, what is Canadian English anyway? Or is it even a thing? And it is. Well, I should say, first of all, there isn't one thing that's Canadian English. As you can imagine, not everyone speaks the same way. There is a lot of variation across the country, variation due to region, and numerous social factors as well. But yes, it is distinct from American English in a number of ways. There are particular vocabulary items, pronunciations, grammatical structures, spelling, and of course, a difference in the history of how English came to each country, the broader context of other languages that are used in the countries. So it is different. And yeah, borders are interesting linguistically because obviously, on the one hand, it seems like they shouldn't mean much, and they don't always. Certain languages, dialects cross borders all the time. But at the same time, we often do find differences just across a border. So, for example, we have things happening with vowels in Canada that are just north of the border that are happening differently just south of the border.
For example?
So language is always changing, and one of the ways in which we notice this is through vowel quality. So vowels, even if you listen to a recording from a few decades ago, you'll notice that it sounds a bit different. So in Canada, we have something called the Canadian shift happening, where we have vowels like I sounding more like A sounding more like A, for example. And in northern New York, the area that you're in, there is a shift called the Northern City shift that's happening, and the vowels are kind of moving in the other direction. So here, that's an interesting example of change just right across the border.
You mentioned influence from other cultures, and as I was thinking about our two countries, I wondered if the differences in immigration patterns, where people come from to settle in Canada, makes a difference. Whether there are pieces of various languages and dialects from around the world that influence Canadian English in a way that they don't influence American English.
Absolutely. And even within Canada, there's the interesting example of Newfoundland. People often say, oh, well, Newfoundland has this very distinct dialect or accent. And that's precisely because of immigration patterns. In terms of the way Newfoundland was settled, which was different from the rest of Canada, people coming from very narrow, particular areas within Britain and Ireland. And that applies on a much broader scale as well, of course. So we have many Indigenous languages in Canada, and they have absolutely impacted the way English is used, particularly in certain communities. But we have vocabulary from Indigenous languages used across English in Canada, whereas you have somewhat different influences in that respect in the United States. And also in terms of more recent immigration, immigrant groups in cities, they vary in terms of the predominant languages, right? So like in Toronto, for example, we have a large number of Cantonese speakers, Italian speakers, Punjabi speakers, and these languages start to creep into English, even within, say, a community where Punjabi is a dominant language, but many people only speak English. Elements of Punjabi, just to use that as an example, find their way into English in terms of vocabulary. There have been some interesting studies looking at what we might call multi-ethnolex, for example, in places like Toronto. So you have so many different immigrant languages all being used in one community. So people start using each other's words when speaking English. So there you can see how you have different immigration patterns in New York versus Toronto versus Los Angeles. So these things do matter.
I know linguists think of, there's something called, standard German in comparison to Austrian German or Swiss German. Is there a standard English?
So different countries have different standards. And I mean, it certainly used to be that British English was the standard everywhere and then American English, but now there's a standard Indian English, for example. That's also tricky because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, not everyone speaks the same way, even within a small area. So it's relevant here. I'll bring up the dictionary project that we're working on
Thank
because,
you for making my segue for me.
yes, all right. So dictionaries, well, with the dictionary, you have this sort of natural tension between descriptive and prescriptive aims. So, descriptive meaning we want to describe how people use language and we want the dictionary to reflect that. But at the same time, people turn to dictionaries because they want a standard. They want to see what's correct, for example. So, in the Canadian context, what has often been considered the standard is really based on the Central West variety, urban middle class speakers of several generations in Canada. But that does not capture most of the population. It excludes many geographic areas, it excludes all kinds of other categories of how people use language. So, yes, often there is what people might describe as a standard in a country, for example, but it usually just actually represents one particular region and doesn't reflect the speech of everyone. And this is something that we are attempting to tackle here with the new dictionary because we're saying we want to create a dictionary for all Canadians based on what we're calling an inclusive standard. So, what does that mean? It means if you're from downtown Toronto, if you're from a small village on the East Coast, if you're from an Indigenous community, you should be able to open the Canadian dictionary and find that your language reflected there. So this is one of our aims, and we're still figuring out how exactly this is going to work. Obviously, we're bringing in voices and expertise from different parts of the country, from different groups of people. We are pondering how it will manifest in the dictionary, for example. Do we list five different alternate pronunciations of a word, for example, rather than just one? And how do we identify the different pronunciations from one another? So it's something that we're still working on, but we're very committed to doing this very much, to including Indigenous voices in the dictionary, to being sensitive to current norms and expectations around terminology for LGBTQ plus words, for example, avoiding sexist language in dictionaries. You would be surprised at how much there is in past dictionaries. So yes, and all of this is because there isn't just one standard.
And this is work that hasn't been done in at least a couple of decades.
That's right. It's been over 20 years now since there was a full-fledged English dictionary in Canada. And almost 10 years ago now, Editors Canada started raising the issue, saying like we need a dictionary for the Canadian market. And it's taken some time to pull together a team, but as of about 2022, we've been actively working on this project.
Well, and let me ask what may be a dumb question, but maybe is not a dumb question. Is the idea to have a dictionary of just Canadian terms, or this is an English dictionary that includes things that people in the United States would recognize, or really anywhere? I mean, is there going to be a definition for the word car, for example, but also words that are part of the Canadian vernacular?
Yes, that is a great question. It will be a full-fledged dictionary, fully reflecting the language. So yes, it will include car and it will include tree and everything else you can think of. There is already a dictionary. It's called the Dictionary of Canadianisms on Historical Principles. And this project, it's an ongoing project and a resource. They are one of the partners in this new dictionary project. So we'll be using the terms in their dictionary. And in this case, they're more focused on what we would call Canadianisms. So these are words that are particular to Canada, if not exclusive to Canada in some way.
Beer store, for example.
There you go.
Why is it important to do this work, and how does it go from theory to practice?
Well, it's important to do the work of a Canadian dictionary because, as we've discussed, Canada does have a distinct variety or distinct varieties of English, and there are practical matters, of course. Editors, students, they want to be able to look up a word to see how it's spelled, how it tends to be spelled in the Canadian context. Spelling is another interesting issue within Canada because we have a lot of variation. And in terms of how it goes from theory to practice, we are plugging away at it step by step. So I can give you an example from the work we've started to do on the letter Q. We chose Q to begin with because it's relatively short, but it has a number of interesting terms in it.
And not as short as X.
Not as short as X, but X lacks, well, X is too short maybe, because what we want to do with Q is we want to refine our procedures, right? We're kind of learning how to do the work as we go, and we're developing guidelines for future contributors, future team members. Yeah, Q has lots of interesting words from indigenous languages and there are a lot of words with queen, for example. What do we do with some of the queen words now that we have a king, for example? Um, Alongside that, I should say, alongside the editorial work, which I'll come back to, there's a lot of other types of work to do. Administrative work, right? Managing a team, incorporating a nonprofit, which we have done, and then running the nonprofit, dealing with social media, managing volunteers. There are many components to the work. As for the editorial process, so we started with Q, and we're using the words from the Dictionary of Canadianisms that I mentioned. And then we've looked at other Q entries from other dictionaries, from other lists of keywords. We have a spreadsheet, and the editorial team went through the spreadsheet. We indicated words we thought could be eliminated, words we wanted to flag for specialist review. We're adding new words. So the first step is to get this rough draft of a list, essentially. And then we have some people focused on definitions. So they are writing, researching definitions. We all come together each week in a meeting, and sometimes we spend an hour discussing what's in a quesadilla. Like, how do you define a quesadilla? As one example, we go down some real rabbit holes, and this is very much a first draft. So whatever we do now will be subject to review by editors, by linguistic experts, by specialty experts. So we have people working on definitions. We have people working on the etymologies, researching origins of words, people working on pronunciations. And we've completed a rough draft of Q at this point. And what it's, it will look probably quite different in the final version, but it's allowed us to develop our procedures and figure out how exactly do we want to do this work. And when we expand the team and bring in more people, what is it that they'll be doing?
This sounds like it's going to take a long time.
It probably will, yes. Yeah, we're optimistic, but we don't have a clean deadline at this point. But we do plan to release letters as they're completed, and there will be a digital dictionary that will also eventually be in print. But what we're hoping to do is get content out there as quickly as possible, including before we have a full final version.
Yeah. What's the difference between a dictionary and what's called a corpus? Because I gather both of these things are what people are things that people who study Canadian English or really any language compile.
So a corpus very kind of loosely refers to a collection of language. And so people will gather a corpus for different purposes, and therefore it may have different kinds of content. For example, at the Strathy unit, we have what we call the Strathy Corpus of Canadian English. And this is several decades worth of mostly written material from a variety of different kinds of sources, informal sources, more formal writing. And then you can use that corpus. You can do searches. You can look at the kinds of words that are used, how they've changed over time in their usage, perhaps, new words that come into being. And we are creating one for this new dictionary, focusing on the last 20 years. So I should say, anyone out there who has Canadian content, written or audio, who would like to contribute it to the corpus, please do. Please get in touch. And another type of corpus is one that has recordings of people speaking and then transcriptions of those recordings, and those are used for language study. So we've created a corpus on Wolf Island. I don't know if that's something you'd like to tell you a bit more about.
You've done another segue for me. Yeah, I gather you and your students over time have drilled down specifically at language on Wolf Island. What makes Wolf Island in particular so interesting?
So let me say first that when it comes to creating a corpus, like the one we did on Wolf Island, what this is essentially is a set of recordings of interviews or oral stories by speakers in a particular community. So when I first started my position at Queen's, right across the river there from you, I wanted to create a corpus of a local community. And Wolf Island was intriguing to me for a few reasons. For one, islands tend to be interesting linguistically. They are often relatively isolated, they have clearly defined borders. And Wolf Island in particular is interesting in that there are families who've been there for multiple generations. So there's a lot of, personal history there on the island. And as I started to think about doing this work on Wolf Island, I realized that the Wolf Island Historical Society was already doing some recordings of their own. They were interested in recording, in particular, some of the older citizens who could talk about the early days, their early days on the island. So we partnered up with them and together did a series of about 100 recordings of different people on the island. And then we transcribed those recordings. And now we have started to do some like linguistic analysis. Some students at Queen's are working on looking at vowels and looking at certain kinds of phrases, for example. We also wanted to have something more public facing where people could experience a bit of what's in these recordings. I have to say, the recordings themselves are just incredible. Stories of the horse and buggy days, of old industries, cheese production, old farming techniques, one-room schools, just very rich, very interesting stories. And so as we were going through the transcripts, we just started noting words that we found interesting, just for one reason or another. We hadn't heard the word before, or it was used in a way we weren't familiar with. And we compiled about 900 of these words and created a website, wordsofwolfisland.com, where we have it's like a little mini dictionary or lexicon where we have the words and the meanings and then examples of the words in context. So we have quotes. So it's a way that people from the island and people outside the island who are curious can learn a little more about it. And I can give you a few examples of words.
Thank heavens, because my next question was going to be, I don't want to play stump the guest, but are there words that stick in your mind or terms that stick in your mind that people might be surprised by or just find interesting?
Yeah, I think so. There are plenty that are interesting to me. Some of my favorites are words based on BEE. So a community gathering to do some kind of work. So people talk about hay bees and wood bees and corn shucking bees. I really like those because they give you a hint of the culture and a hint of, the industries on the island. There are also words that are used in ways that were unfamiliar to me. For example, the word neighbor used as a verb. She liked to neighbor in the summers, meaning she liked to congregate with her neighbors. We have a use of the word treed in the line. I believe it's something like the goat had everybody treed, meaning the goat scared the kids. They were running away and they ran up the tree. These are words that I certainly don't encounter much. And especially for the students who were helping with the transcripts, they flagged a number of words that they hadn't heard before. I just love that they give us a window into life, certainly past life on the island.
Well, and this kind of speaks to, for people who might just think of linguistics as kind of a vague study of how we use words. It really shows that like this is as much about history and sociology as it is about spelling.
Absolutely. I mean, linguistics is the study of language, and language is, I think most people would say language is very important. It's fundamental to who we are, right? So it's language is how we express ourselves, it's how we communicate, it's closely linked to identity and to culture. Um, then there are the physiological aspects of language as well, language and cognition. What's happening in our brains when we speak, when we hear language? There's so much we don't know about that. And as we study that branch of linguistics, we're learning more about language, but we're also learning more about our brains, right? And then there's the speech apparatus, right? We could go on and on. So, how is it that we physically are producing sounds with the vocal tract? And what does it mean? And what can we do if people have a disorder when it comes to articulating speech? Or the communication between the brain and the vocal apparatus is not working the way we expect. So, yeah, I would say linguistics is kind of the study of everything, if you want to think of it that way.
Well, and so the thing that first sent me down the rabbit hole that eventually led me to contact you was the announcement that there was a Canadian word of the year that emerged from the dictionary project. And it seems maybe a little ironic for a Canadian English dictionary project that the word of the year this past year or maybe for this coming year was maple washing.
Yes, yes, good point. So maple washing, just to clarify for your listeners, refers to the deceptive practice of making things seem more Canadian than they actually are. So this has come up in the past year, especially in light of the US tariffs. There's been a big push to buy Canadian. Signs that perhaps used to say things like made in Canada now say things like, or some other signs say things like made for Canada. It's amazing what the difference in the preposition can make. Or slapping maple leaves on products just to make them appear Canadian. That is not something we plan to do with this dictionary. In fact, you might say we are working to not maple wash the the new Canadian English dictionary.
Even if maple wash finds its way into the dictionary.
No doubt it will be in the dictionary, yes, but it will not describe the dictionary.
So we have not pointed this out yet, but we should note that you are not originally from Canada, but from Iowa, a place that you described to me when we chatted before as if there were a home for a standard American accent, it would be Iowa. Do you think coming at this work as a transplanted Canadian gives you kind of a unique insight into the language in Canada?
I think it does, absolutely. I think I probably notice things that people in Canada wouldn't notice, wouldn't reflect upon because they haven't seen the contrast. And oftentimes, linguists, they are studying languages that aren't their own language. It gives you different kinds of insight, which isn't to say that there's anything wrong with or there's nothing insightful about studying your own language. Being from Eastern Iowa is interesting in the linguistic context because what is often described as standard general American is actually can be kind of pinpointed to that part of Iowa. It's kind of the generic accent. And in fact, when I was first studying linguistics, there was a phonology professor, someone who studies sounds from Europe, and he was so excited to meet me because to him, I really represented what he'd always read was, standard, general American English, and he'd never heard it before. Or he never had a specimen like me there where he could kind of interrogate me and get me to pronounce lists of words for him, which I would do regularly. But it's also interesting in the Canadian context because many features of what we think of as standard Canadian are similar to what we find in that part of the United States. In fact, I remember teaching Canadian English courses years ago, and I'd have lists of features that supposedly existed in, or I shouldn't say supposedly, but did have existed in Canadian English. And I would say, okay, who says this? Who says that? And often my students wouldn't say the things that had been described, at least this particular generation for Canadian, but I would say them. There's a construction called positive anymore. When most people use the word anymore, they would say it in a negative context, like negative polarity anymore. So they might say, we don't go to that store anymore. But there's a construction called positive anymore, which is common in Eastern Iowa, certainly. It's the raccoons who live here anymore, meaning, these days, the raccoons have overtaken the neighborhood, right? So this is a construction that many people find very odd and can't understand. And it has been described for standard Canadian English. But I find that at least the students I would teach in my Canadian English courses at Queen's didn't know what this meant.
What got you down the linguistic rabbit hole?
I started out studying English as an undergrad. I was very interested in still am interested in English language and literature. And I took an introduction to linguistics course kind of by accident, to be honest. Didn't know what I was getting into, and it blew my mind. It was such a different way of looking at language, this very analytical approach of breaking down different languages and trying to understand how they pattern. So then I went on to study linguistics in graduate school. That was the first step down a long path.
Well, and I gather you have done a lot of work in studying languages that are actually disappearing in places, in part due to climate change. And I realize this could be a completely separate interview on its own. But really briefly, what does climate change have to do with language, and what are the other factors that are causing languages to disappear around the world?
There is a big crisis of language endangerment and language loss right now. There are about 7,000 languages spoken in the world today, and estimates put the number at risk between 50 to 90%, perhaps, which is clearly a huge amount. And there are many different reasons for this. The rise and spread of global languages, regional languages, national languages that are putting pressure on smaller languages. So if you have in China, for example, you have many, many indigenous languages, but Mandarin is the language of government, of education, of the media. And so people start shifting to Mandarin and speaking their indigenous languages less. And it's not China. This is happening everywhere. There is, of course, also overt repression of linguistic minority groups by governments. That's a factor. And climate, I'm afraid, is also increasingly a factor. And the way that that's manifesting is I see it as kind of an exacerbator of the other challenges. So if you have people in a small community who are forced to migrate due to climate change, due to rising sea levels, due to drought, due to extreme heat, when they leave their linguistic community and settle somewhere else, most likely that's in the context of other languages. So they're less likely to use their indigenous languages. And so, yeah, I see it as kind of maybe a tipping point for languages in a way where there are already so many languages are so vulnerable, and climate change is just really pushing them even closer to the brink.
I'm just curious, how many languages or parts of languages do you speak?
This is the question that every linguist hates to get, to be honest, because it implies that studying linguistics is about learning
Right.
languages, which isn't the case, although many linguists do speak a number of languages. Um, so when I was in graduate school, because I knew I wanted to work on endangered languages, I studied Indonesian, learned to speak Indonesian so that I could work in Indonesia on smaller languages and use it as a lingua franca. Similarly, I learned to speak Bislama when I was doing work in Vanuatu. Bislama is the national language. It's what we would call an English lexifier Creole, meaning it's constructed of many vocabulary words from English, but the grammar of the local Melanesian languages. And I studied French in university. So
And you live in Canada, so that's useful. I mean,
and I live in Canada, yeah. So I may not be the shining example of a linguist who's fluent in 10 languages, but however, I study and have studied many different languages because, of course, the skills and the methods that you apply to language study can be applied to any language.
and maybe that was why I tried to qualify that question with pieces of languages, because yeah, I mean, I gathered to go to some place like Indonesia and be able to communicate with people in languages that are disappearing. You have to have some language in common. So it's I wasn't accusing.
No,
I didn't want to
you did.
ask the linguist the question that they hate the most.
Yes, I shouldn't have phrased it in that way. And you're right, you did say pieces of language. Yeah, I give you credit for that. Yeah, absolutely. And when you are working on minority languages, endangered languages, in order to do that work, you need to speak a common language with people, or at least some people in the community. Absolutely. You're right. You're right. It is a very important skill for a field linguist to have to speak other languages.
So getting back to the Canadian English Dictionary Project, did you and your team ever agree on what a quesadilla is?
Preliminarily, yeah, preliminary. I'm not sure if everyone's on board, but actually, that's an example of a case where think about what's in a quesadilla, right? You can put all kinds of things in a quesadilla. So the trick is how do you define it in a way that's like a prototypical quesadilla? So I believe we decided to keep it on the fewer ingredients end of things, tortilla and cheese. And then we're using sample sentences and other examples of phrases to further flesh out words. So you can describe a quesadilla as consisting of tortilla and cheese, but then you can have a sample sentence saying that you made a delicious vegetarian quesadilla last night with peppers and tomatoes, right? So that is not exactly what it's going to look like in the dictionary, but It's in the works.
Quesadillas and beyond. It is really interesting stuff. And Anastasia Riehl, thank you so much for sharing this work with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Anastasia Riehl leads the Strathie Language Unit at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and is involved in the effort to create a new Canadian English dictionary. You can find out more about that effort and also see a link to the Words of Wolf Island project at ncpr.org/northwards. Ethan Chanty back in the studio with us. Hiya, Ethan.
Mitch, what are your 2 favorite words?
I like gasket.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily for the meaning. I just love the sound of the word gasket.
I have a very similar answer. Okay, and then your second?
Also nuance.
Nuance. Okay. 2 favorite words. The first, similar reasons, just like the way it sounds. Lunch. Not even what it means. Obviously, I'm hungry right now. So that might be influencing.
Ask you that question when it's not 1 p.m.
I like the way the word lunch sounds, but I would never use it like in a poem or anything. Obviously, who cares about lunch? And my other favorite word is amanuensis.
Oh, which is a word that I have heard, and I couldn't tell you what it means.
An amanuensis is a person. It's like dictated but not read. A person who's like taking notes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
I like it.
I'd like to have an amanuensis app.
And you can probably find one or build one. You're an app builder.
Yes, I am.
I'm picturing an app builder like a ship builder, a guy who's on a dock just.
And that reminds me, going back to the conversation we had before the interview with feeling like my use of the language is dated.
Uh-huh.
There's a period at which people started using the word app to be short for appetizer, and I can't abide by that because somebody will say, let's get some apps or whatever, and I will look at my phone and think, what apps do I not have that I need at this point?
I don't have the new Angry Birds. Oh my God.
But of course, I still refer to the things on my phone as software.
You are old.
Could you tell us who puts this show together each and every week so that people know?
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Chanty. Bill Hanel is our Director of Digital Services, and Caitlin Kelly handles our social media. Our theme music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. To hear more conversations and to support the show, visit ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.
Ethan, I hope you're really stoked by that.